So now let's go to Cologne, where we catch up again with a Dadaist who will eventually turn surrealist, Max Ernst, and his fantastic imagery. This collage, the dissolvable snail and the heart of the swift-running harvestress from 1920. I have no idea what that means. So Ernst is using found materials, very Dada. He's cutting up an education supplies catalog. So again, he's eliminating handwork, craft, right? That's that high art skill by turning to found material. This is Dada. This is his version of anti-art. Ernst said about this process, "One rainy day in 1919, my excited gaze was provoked by the pages of a printed catalog. The advertisements illustrated objects relating to anthropological, microscopical, psychological, mineralogical, and paleontological research. Here I discovered the elements of a figuration so remote that its very absurdity provoked in me a sudden intensification of my faculties of sight. A hallucinatory succession of contradictory images, double, triple, multiple. By simply painting or drawing, it sufficed to add to the illustrations a color, a line, a landscape foreign to the objects represented, a desert, a sky, a geological section, a floor, a single straight horizontal expressing the horizon, and so forth. These changes, no more than docile reproductions of what was visible within me, recorded a faithful and fixed image of my hallucination. They transformed the banal pages of advertisement into dramas, which revealed my most secret desires." End of quote. Wow, that says it all, right? Here's another work from the Art Institute called Dada Gauguin, great title, 1920. Ernst had studied philosophy in Bonn, and then in 1911 sees a collection of so-called art of the insane, which you will recall is part of this larger primitivism story, right? Children, African art, art of the insane, it all gets lumped together. So Ernst sees this collection of so-called outsider art, and its honesty, its directness, its expressivity blows his mind, and he begins to follow suit. Here's another great Max Ernst, which was actually a collaboration with Jean Arp. They called this kind of work Fata Gaga because they were made of photo montage from popular magazines. This one is called Here Everything is Still Floating, Fata Gaga, the third gasometric picture from 1920. And you can see this wonderful montage, a collage of the fish and the boat and the sky. This Max Ernst is called Health Through Sports, also from 1920. Very nice to see the male nude for a minute, especially with his golf club, wink, wink. Now, the Dadaists organized an exhibition in Cologne in the 20s made up of found objects. There are no photographs of the exhibition, but there is a written record of the show. It was organized by Ernst, Arp, and the artist Bargeld, and it was held in a small courtyard reached by going through the bathroom of a building. That is so Dada, right? Visitors on opening day were met by a small girl dressed in a white communion gown reciting obscene poems. The exhibition contained a large number of found objects, so-called disposable objects. One sculpture by Ernst had an axe attached to it with which the audience was invited to destroy the work. The artist Bargeld included a small glass tank filled with red-colored water with a wig of hair floating on the surface, a wooden human hand protruding from the water, and an alarm clock at the bottom. What would Freud say now? It was all very Dada, and the chief constable in Cologne actually tried to prosecute them, the Dadaists, with fraud for charging an entrance fee for an art exhibition, which he claimed was nothing of the sort. Max Ernst, of course, responded with, quote, "We said quite plainly that it is a Dada exhibition. Dada has never claimed to have anything to do with art. If the public confuses the two, that is no fault of ours." So the Zurich Dadaist, Holzenbeck, goes to Berlin in 1918, and Dada then takes off in this city, culminating in a major international Dada fair in 1920. Berlin Dada was more overtly political. Dada tends to be more indirect, but Berlin was in really bad shape after the war. Food was incredibly scarce, despair was spreading. It was a bad scene. So Dada in Berlin mostly included ephemeral work on paper, posters, or impromptu performance pieces. I want to show you the work of the Berlin Dadaist Hana Hawk. I'm showing you her Cut with the Kitchen Knife collage from 1920. Hawk's montage again denies the artistic handiwork in favor of appropriation, right? Here she is deploying newspapers and magazines, cutting them up, making collage, and this would have been very jarring, as viewers would recognize the material from the common magazines she would use, and they would be shocked to see such familiar images turned into this wild Dada expose, the world as topsy-turvy. In this piece, she includes famous political figures, Berlin Dada was political, and the trappings of an industrialized and militarized landscape. The men of Dada tried to minimize Hawk's presence in the movement in multiple ways. In his book, Dada, Art and Anti-Art, Hans Richter described her as, quote, a tiny voice with, quote, slightly nun-like grace, whose main purpose, evidently, was to get the sandwiches and make the coffee. Ugh. So despite their 7-year-long relationship, Raoul Haussmann, her lover, included Hawk only minimally in his memoirs. So although I'm focusing on a woman Dadaist, there were still incredible challenges to being a woman artist at this time. Now, in 1916, Hana Hawk had found work in Berlin as a designer of embroidery and lace and a pattern maker at the large Ullstein Publishing Company. She worked there 3 days a week until about 1926. And in this untitled piece from 1921, you can see the backdrop is one of her patterns, against which she has collaged this rather sad face of a dancing girl standing on and against a backdrop of industrial culture. There are these meat grinders at the bottom. They recall the traditional role for women, which she's trying to push against, despite all the men with bugs on their heads, you can see that on the right, who would get in her way. Decades before the contemporary artist Cindy Sherman began to look at the stereotypical roles of women in Hollywood films, she would dress up in different costumes, different guises, and then photograph herself as a way of unpacking how the social codes around us influence our sense of ourselves. Over 50 years earlier, Hana Hawk was reassembling images of women out of the bits and pieces of magazines and newspapers and photographs, underscoring the schizophrenic roles presented to women at the time. In Russian Dancer of 1928 and another work from the period, Hawk explored this new concept of the new woman in Weimar Germany. And in her collages, she's looking at issues of gender and identity. Here, the masculine short haircut of the powerful woman with monocle, but this is all undercut by her cute little ballet legs. And then this work from the series called From an Ethnographic Museum, in which Hawk combines images of female bodies with traditional African and oceanic masks and objects. These are powerful statements about the kind of primitivism that we've seen wielded by the avant-garde male artists. Here she is presenting herself then as the double other, as both woman, as both exotic, super primitive. I want to compare Hawk with the contemporary artist Mary Lou Zelazny, who is an alum from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Collage remains a key device for artists dealing with the subject of identity and the commodity culture in which they are so often aligned, particularly women. So Zelazny constructs her images of women out of the paraphernalia of mass culture, media culture. Once Zelazny has the armature of the composition sketched in, the collage pieces are chosen one at a time. So there's this playful free association of the forms as she's making the image. Schwitters did this too. Most collage artists, frankly, don't know what the next move is. It's rather an unfolding and responsive process. It's about intuition. I also want to note Romare Bearden's collages as well in this context of identity, collage as a place of thinking through issues of identity. For Bearden, this was about African American identity getting teased out through the use of found, given media representations. And this is Bearden's Pittsburgh Memory from 1964. Now, the Art Institute has many fine examples of the Hanover Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, who speaks of the modern artist's new source of inspiration, and I quote, "Catalogs, posters, advertisements of all sorts. Believe me, they contain the poetry of our epoch. I shall make it spring forth." End of quote. Here's Schwitter's Aerated 8, one of his März pieces from 1942. In the picture, we find an arrangement of material from his everyday daily activities: old ticket stubs, matchbooks, daily newspapers, photo clippings. These are rather rich and complex works, but in a small scale, where he carefully organizes and assembles his daily items into these Cubist collages. And you can see that fractured Cubist look. The title März, which he uses over and over again, is a kind of Dada wordplay, with the word März coming from Commerzbank, which is a scrap he had used in one of his collages. Schwitter's formal elegance, I would argue, is not so Dada, despite the use of all of this anti-art found material. Now let's jump back to France and Cubism for a moment and talk about the second stage of Cubism, often referred to as synthetic Cubism, which Schwitters and others know well. The first stage was analytic Cubism, and this was wonderfully represented by the Art Institute's piece by Picasso, the painting of Henry Kahnweiler, that we studied earlier in the course. But the second stage of Cubism, or synthetic Cubism, we need to put into our chronology because a lot of the Dadaists and Surrealists are using the same kind of found materials, and this all begins with Picasso and Braque. So while Picasso is exploring Cubism, he begins to introduce collage elements into the work as part of those scintillating planes, right? Here is his famous still life with chair caning from 1912, supposedly one of the earliest works to include collage material. There is the chair caning print on cloth, which is a sort of wallpaper, and you can see that in the lower left of the composition. And then you see this actual rope as the frame, and then he draws and paints on top of this found material. The rope actually may have been inspired by hemp frames that were typical for popular chromolithographs at the time that Picasso owned. So this is essentially an image of the cafe table with the letters Jou from journal or newspaper. Then there's a sliced lemon and glass at the right in high analytic cubism, the stem of a pipe. It's a safe enough image, but it's one of those remarkable avant-garde moments for really no one had used found materials before, very few, certainly no avant-garde artists at that time. So the implications of bringing mass culture into high art were huge. Here begins a very long and deep debate about high versus low art, a debate that we will take up when we turn to pop art. Now, Picasso is working closely with Braque during these Cubist exercises, and here's another Art Institute work by Braque titled Still Life from 1914. Braque was actually doing these paper collé, paper cutouts very early, and he's putting these paper cutouts into paintings, thereby complicating the illusions within. So he's illusionistically painting paper cutouts sometimes in the same composition where he's added the actual collage. So essentially, Braque is simulating real textures sometimes and then putting in the textures in other cases. This all makes more sense when we understand that Braque was the son of a house painter and decorator, right? So the artist Braque by including both painted images and actual images in the same composition, engages in this strange interplay of reality and illusion. And this is why we go to works of art, right? So that we can remember how slippery the realms of fantasy and reality are. Collage, made from everyday materials, is still very much a part of contemporary art. And I was showing you Lou Zelazny earlier when we were talking about Hana Hawk. Here's another work by the LA artist Marc Bradford, who began his career by using pressed permanent wave papers from his mother's hair salon. Isn't that great? He worked as a stylist as well. So Bradford makes these incredible abstractions from the art supplies, in quotes, that he finds at Home Depot. That's his art store, Home Depot. He starts with a stretched canvas, and then he builds up the surface with 10, sometimes 15 layers of colored paper or white paper, newsprint, reproductions, photographs, printed text, all the stuff he gets his hands on. Then he fixes each layer with a coat of clear shellac. When the surface reaches a certain density, Bradford then attacks it with power sanders and other tools, exposing the earlier layers, revealing unexpected juxtaposition. So it's very cool collage, and then it's a deconstructed collage. Race is often his subject. This will come through a number of the works. He's an African-American artist committed to this topic.